What begins as a normal exchange suddenly turns tense as Kenneth Branagh challenges Joy Behar directly. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins like many segments do on a daytime talk show similar to The View, with a relaxed tone, light audience applause, and a host introduction that feels both familiar and inviting. On this particular morning, the panel welcomes Kenneth Branagh, an actor and director widely respected for his work in both film and theater. The atmosphere at first is warm, even appreciative. The hosts, including Joy Behar, begin by highlighting his recent projects, noting his long-standing reputation in the industry. Branagh appears composed, offering thoughtful answers in a steady, conversational tone. He smiles politely, leaning slightly forward in his chair as he listens, signaling engagement. His responses are measured, almost reflective, as he speaks about storytelling, directing, and the challenges of adapting classic works for modern audiences. The audience reacts positively, with occasional applause and soft laughter at light remarks. The conversation flows naturally for the first several minutes. One of the co-hosts brings up Branagh's work in adapting historical narratives and classic literature, asking how he balances authenticity with contemporary relevance. He explains his approach carefully, emphasizing respect for source material while acknowledging the need to connect with today's viewers. His tone remains calm and his body language relaxed, hands occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point, but never dramatically. At this stage, Joy Behar leans in slightly, her expression shifting from casual interest to something more inquisitive. She poses a question that initially seems aligned with the discussion, but introduces a subtle shift in tone. She asks about the broader cultural responsibility of filmmakers when presenting historical or literary works, particularly in a modern context where audiences are more sensitive to representation and interpretation. Branagh listens attentively, nodding once before responding. He acknowledges the importance of awareness and responsibility, but frames it within the context of artistic freedom. He speaks about the need for balance, explaining that while creators should be mindful, they must also be allowed space to interpret and present stories authentically. His tone remains respectful, though slightly more deliberate now, as if choosing each word with extra care. The audience remains quiet during this exchange, sensing a more serious direction. The other hosts watch closely, some nodding in agreement, others appearing thoughtful. Joy Behar follows up, this time with a more pointed remark. She suggests that certain adaptations in the past may not have fully considered modern perspectives, implying that creators sometimes overlook the impact their portrayals can have. There's a subtle pause before Branagh responds. It's not long, but noticeable enough in the rhythm of live television. He maintains eye contact, his posture still composed, but there's a slight tightening in his expression, an indication that the conversation is becoming more nuanced. He responds by clarifying his position. He agrees that reflection and growth are essential in any creative field, but pushes back gently on the idea that past works should be judged solely by present standards. He explains that context matters, and that understanding the time and intention behind a piece is just as important as evaluating its impact today. His tone is still calm, but there's a firmness now that wasn't there before. It's not confrontational, but it's clear he is drawing a line in how he wants the discussion framed. The audience reacts with a few scattered murmurs, nothing disruptive, but enough to indicate engagement. Joy Behar listens, but her expression suggests she's not entirely convinced. She tilts her head slightly and raises her eyebrows, a familiar gesture to viewers of the show. She interjects briefly, pointing out that audiences today don't always separate context from impact, and that public figures, especially those involved in storytelling, carry a certain level of responsibility regardless of intent. At this point, the dynamic begins to shift more noticeably. The easy back and forth of earlier moments gives way to a more deliberate exchange. Branagh leans back slightly, then forward again, as if resetting his posture before responding. He nods once, acknowledging her point, but then carefully reiterates his perspective. He explains that responsibility and artistic interpretation are not mutually exclusive, and that reducing complex works to a single modern lens can sometimes limit understanding rather than expand it. His voice remains even, but there's a subtle emphasis on certain words, signaling that he feels strongly about this distinction. One of the co-hosts attempts to mediate, offering a bridging comment about how both perspectives can coexist. The tone softens briefly as the conversation widens, but the underlying tension remains. The camera cuts between Branagh and Behar, capturing their expressions, his measured and composed, hers engaged and slightly skeptical. The audience senses the shift as well. Applause becomes more restrained, replaced by attentive silence. It's the kind of moment where viewers at home might lean in a little closer, recognizing that the conversation has moved beyond a standard promotional interview. Joy Behar returns to the discussion with another question, this time referencing specific examples of adaptations that have sparked public debate. While she doesn't directly criticize Branagh's work, the implication is clear. She's challenging the broader framework he's defending. Branagh listens without interrupting, his hands now resting together in his lap. When he responds, he does so with a slightly slower cadence, as if ensuring clarity. He acknowledges the examples but emphasizes that each project should be evaluated individually, rather than grouped into a single narrative about responsibility or oversight. There's a brief moment where both pause, neither speaking for a second or two. In live television, even a short silence can feel significant. The camera lingers just long enough to capture the shift in energy. Another co-host steps in again, this time with a lighter comment, attempting to ease the tension. There's a small ripple of laughter from the audience, and for a moment, the atmosphere relaxes. Branagh smiles politely, and even Behar's expression softens slightly. But the conversation doesn't fully return to its earlier ease. The topic has been opened, and both participants have made it clear they have defined perspectives. The remainder of the segment begins to balance between maintaining that thoughtful tension and keeping the tone appropriate for a daytime audience. As part one comes to a close, the exchange has not escalated into anything overtly confrontational, but it has clearly shifted from a standard interview into something more substantive. The groundwork has been laid for a deeper discussion, one that is likely to continue developing as the segment moves forward. As the conversation continues, the tone remains steady, but there's a noticeable shift in how carefully each person chooses their words. The earlier ease hasn't fully returned, and instead, the discussion settles into something more deliberate, the kind of exchange that feels thoughtful on the surface, but carries a quiet tension underneath. Kenneth Branagh sits upright, his posture composed, his expression attentive. He appears fully engaged, listening not just to respond, but to understand the direction the conversation is taking. Across from him, Joy Behar maintains her focus, her body angled slightly forward, signaling that she intends to continue exploring the point she raised earlier. One of the co-hosts briefly steps in again, attempting to widen the conversation by bringing up how audiences have evolved over time. She mentions that viewers today often expect more awareness from creators, especially when dealing with sensitive or historically complex material. It's a comment that doesn't directly challenge Branagh, but it reinforces the line of questioning that Behar introduced. Branagh nods as he listens, then responds in a measured tone. He acknowledges that audiences change, and that expectations naturally shift over time. He explains that as a filmmaker and storyteller, he is aware of those changes, but he also emphasizes that storytelling cannot exist solely within the boundaries of current expectations. He notes that part of the value of storytelling is its ability to present different perspectives, even ones that may feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar. His delivery remains calm, but there's a quiet firmness in how he frames his response. It's clear he is not dismissing the concern, but he is pushing back against what he seems to view as an overly restrictive approach. Behar listens, but as he finishes, she interjects again, this time more directly. She suggests that the concern isn't about restriction, but about accountability. Her tone is still conversational, but there's a sharper edge to her phrasing now. She points out that when creators have a large platform, their choices can influence public perception in significant ways. There's a slight pause as Branagh takes in the comment. He doesn't interrupt, and when he begins to speak, his tone remains steady, though his expression tightens just slightly. He clarifies that he agrees with the idea of accountability, but he draws a distinction between being accountable and being constrained. He explains that if creators begin to anticipate every possible reaction or criticism, it can limit the authenticity of their work. The audience remains quiet, listening closely. There's a sense that both sides are presenting thoughtful arguments, but neither is fully yielding. The conversation isn't heated, but it's clearly more serious than a typical daytime segment. At this point, another co-host leans in, attempting to reframe the discussion in a more neutral way. She asks Branagh about his personal approach, how he navigates these concerns when working on a project. It's a question that invites reflection rather than debate. Branagh takes a moment before answering. He speaks about collaboration, about listening to different voices during the creative process, and about being open to feedback. He emphasizes that filmmaking is not a solitary effort, and that many perspectives contribute to the final product. His tone softens slightly here, and for a moment, the conversation feels more balanced. But Behar returns to the discussion with a follow-up that brings the tension back into focus. She references how public reaction can sometimes highlight issues that creators may not have considered, and she asks whether he believes creators should revisit or reassess their work in response to that feedback. The question lands with a bit more weight. Branagh leans back slightly, then forward again, a small but noticeable shift in posture. He nods once, acknowledging the premise, but his response is careful. He explains that reflection is always valuable, and that listening to audiences can provide important insight. However, he adds that revisiting work should not mean rewriting intent after the fact. He suggests that once a piece is created and released, it becomes part of a broader conversation, one that includes both the creator's perspective and the audience's interpretation. His tone remains calm, but there's a subtle emphasis in how he speaks, as though he is drawing a clear boundary around the idea of creative ownership. Behar listens, her expression thoughtful but still slightly skeptical. She responds by saying that audience interpretation often becomes the dominant narrative, regardless of the creator's original intent. Her point seems to be that once something is released, control over its meaning shifts. There's a brief moment where both perspectives sit side by side, neither fully overriding the other. The camera cuts to the other hosts, who appear engaged but cautious, aware that the conversation is balancing on a fine line. One of them offers a light comment, something intended to ease the atmosphere. There's a small ripple of laughter from the audience, and Branagh smiles politely. Even Behar allows a brief smile, but the underlying tension doesn't fully dissipate. As the discussion continues, the pacing becomes slightly slower. Each response is more measured, with fewer interruptions. It's as if both participants are aware of the direction the conversation could take and are choosing to keep it controlled. Branagh elaborates further on his perspective, speaking about the importance of nuance in storytelling. He explains that stories often reflect the complexities of human experience, and that simplifying them to meet a single expectation can sometimes diminish their impact. His voice remains even, but there's a quiet conviction in his words. Behar responds by acknowledging the value of nuance, but she reiterates that clarity and responsibility are equally important. She suggests that without careful consideration, nuance can sometimes be misunderstood or misused. The exchange continues in this way, each point met with a thoughtful counterpoint. There are no raised voices, no overt signs of conflict, but the difference in perspective is clear. It's the kind of discussion that feels more like a debate than an interview, though it remains within the boundaries of respectful conversation. The audience remains attentive throughout. There are occasional nods, a few scattered murmurs, but mostly a quiet focus. It's the kind of moment where viewers can sense that something meaningful is being discussed, even if it's not dramatic. As the segment progresses, the producers appear to signal a shift, and one of the co-hosts begins to steer the conversation toward a broader conclusion. She asks a question that invites both Branagh and Behar to reflect on common ground, what they agree on, rather than where they differ. Branagh responds first, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and understanding. He notes that conversations like this are valuable because they allow different perspectives to be shared openly. His tone softens slightly, and there's a sense that he is attempting to bring the discussion to a more balanced place. Behar follows, agreeing that dialogue is important. She acknowledges that creative work is complex and that there are no simple answers. Her tone is less pointed now, more reflective, though she doesn't fully step back from her earlier position. The tension, while still present, begins to ease slightly as both sides acknowledge the broader context of the discussion. It doesn't feel resolved, but it feels contained, like a conversation that has reached a natural pause rather than a definitive conclusion. As part 2 comes to an end, the exchange remains thoughtful and grounded, with both Kenneth Branagh and Joy Behar maintaining their composure. The discussion has deepened, moving beyond surface-level commentary into something more substantive, while still staying within the tone and expectations of a daytime talk show similar to The View. As the segment continues, There's a subtle shift in how the conversation is being managed. The earlier back and forth has settled into a more structured rhythm, but the underlying difference in perspective remains clearly present. The hosts appear more intentional now, choosing their moments to speak rather than overlapping, and allowing each response to land fully before moving forward. Kenneth Branagh maintains his composed posture, though his body language reflects a heightened level of focus. His hands, which earlier moved freely as he spoke, are now more still, occasionally coming together as he listens. Across from him, Joy Behar remains engaged, her expression attentive, but with a continued sense of scrutiny in how she responds. One of the co-hosts steps in with a question that appears, on the surface, to shift the conversation slightly. She asks Branagh about his experience working across different types of stories and whether audience expectations vary depending on the genre or subject matter. It's a broader question, one that offers an opportunity to move away from the more pointed exchange. Branagh responds with a thoughtful answer, explaining that expectations do indeed shift depending on the context of the story. He talks about how audiences approach historical narratives differently from contemporary ones, and how tone, setting, and intention all influence how a piece is received. His voice is steady, and for a moment, the discussion feels more aligned with a traditional interview format again. The audience responds with light applause, appreciating the return to a more familiar flow. The atmosphere softens slightly, and one of the hosts nods in agreement, adding a brief comment about how viewers often bring their own perspectives into what they watch. But as Branagh finishes his explanation, Behar re-enters the conversation in a way that gently redirects it back to the earlier point. She acknowledges what he said, but then adds that regardless of genre, creators are still operating within a modern audience landscape. Her tone is not confrontational, but there's a renewed directness in how she frames her comment. She asks whether there are moments where he has reconsidered creative choices after seeing how audiences responded, whether feedback has ever changed his perspective in a meaningful way. There's a brief pause before Branagh answers. It's not hesitation so much as consideration. He nods once, then explains that feedback can be valuable, but it doesn't necessarily alter the foundation of how he approaches storytelling. He describes it as an ongoing process of learning rather than a reactionary adjustment. His response is calm, but there's a slight emphasis when he speaks about not allowing external reactions to dictate creative decisions entirely. It's a continuation of the boundary he established earlier, now reinforced with a bit more clarity. Behar listens, her expression thoughtful but still measured. She responds by pointing out that for many viewers, representation and interpretation are not abstract concepts, they're personal. Her tone softens slightly here, but the weight of her point is clear. She's not just discussing theory, she's emphasizing impact. The exchange becomes quieter, more focused. The other hosts remain attentive, but less inclined to interrupt. It's as if the conversation has reached a point where adding too many voices might disrupt its balance. Branagh acknowledges her point directly. He agrees that storytelling can have a personal impact and that this is part of its power. But he adds that this same power is what makes it important to preserve a range of perspectives. He explains that if stories are shaped too narrowly, they risk losing the diversity of thought that gives them depth. His tone remains respectful, but there's a quiet firmness that suggests he's fully aware of the difference in viewpoint and is comfortable maintaining his position. At this point, one of the co-hosts gently interjects, noting that the conversation highlights a broader cultural discussion happening beyond the show itself. She frames it as a reflection of how audiences and creators are navigating change together. It's an attempt to contextualize the exchange without taking a side. There's a brief moment of agreement across the panel. Heads nod, and the audience offers a small round of applause. The tension eases slightly, though it doesn't disappear entirely. The discussion then shifts toward a more personal angle. Another host asks Branagh how he approaches conversations like this in his professional life, whether he engages directly with criticism or prefers to focus on the work itself. Branagh answers thoughtfully, explaining that he tries to listen without becoming defensive, but also without losing sight of his own perspective. He describes it as a balance between openness and conviction. His tone here is more reflective, and it brings a slightly calmer energy back into the segment. Behar responds with a brief comment acknowledging that balance, though she adds that it's not always easy to maintain. There's a hint of agreement in her tone, even if it doesn't fully align with Branagh's earlier points. The audience reacts positively to this moment, with a bit more audible applause. It's a small but noticeable shift, an indication that viewers appreciate the more personal and less abstract direction of the conversation. However, as the segment continues, there's one more moment that brings the earlier tension back into focus. Behar references how public discussions around media have become more immediate and widespread, particularly with social media. She notes that reactions can now shape narratives quickly, sometimes within hours of a release. She asks Branagh whether this immediacy changes how he approaches his work, or if it adds pressure in a way that didn't exist before. Branagh listens carefully, then responds with a measured answer. He acknowledges that the speed of public reaction has changed significantly, and that it's something creators are aware of. But he emphasizes that while awareness is necessary, it cannot become the driving force behind creative decisions. His tone remains steady, but there's a clear sense of resolve in how he speaks. It's not dismissive, but it's definitive. He's reinforcing the idea that while feedback matters, it does not override the core principles of storytelling. Behar nods slightly, though her expression suggests she still sees the issue from a different angle. She doesn't interrupt this time, allowing his point to stand. It's a subtle shift in dynamic, less pushback, more observation. The conversation begins to slow again, with longer pauses between responses. The hosts appear to be preparing to transition toward the next segment, but there's still a sense that the discussion has left an impression. One of the co-hosts offers a closing-style comment for this portion, noting that conversations like this reflect the evolving relationship between creators and audiences. It's framed as a broader takeaway rather than a conclusion. Branagh nods, offering a brief acknowledgement, and Behar does the same. There's no explicit resolution, but there's a mutual recognition of the complexity of the topic. The audience responds with polite applause, slightly more sustained than before. It's not a reaction to a single statement, but to the conversation as a whole. As Part 3 comes to a close, the exchange between Kenneth Branagh and Joy Behar remains measured and respectful, yet clearly defined by differing perspectives. The discussion has moved through multiple layers, professional, cultural, and personal, without losing the grounded tone expected from a show like The View, setting the stage for how the segment will ultimately wrap up. As the segment moves forward, there's a noticeable effort from the panel to bring the conversation toward a more balanced and reflective place, but the underlying difference in perspective still lingers. The energy in the studio is calmer than before, yet more focused. It's the kind of atmosphere where every comment feels slightly more deliberate, as if everyone involved is aware that the discussion has carried more weight than a typical daytime exchange. Kenneth Branagh remains composed, though his posture now reflects a quieter intensity. He sits upright, shoulders relaxed but steady, maintaining eye contact with whoever is speaking. His expressions are subtle, small nods, slight shifts in focus, indicating that he's still fully engaged in the conversation. Across from him, Joy Behar appears equally attentive. Her tone has softened compared to earlier moments, but there's still a clear sense of conviction in how she frames her thoughts. Rather than pressing as directly as before, she now seems to be choosing her words more carefully, allowing space for the discussion to breathe. One of the co-hosts steps in with a transitional comment, acknowledging that conversations like this can be difficult to navigate in a limited time. She notes that both perspectives being shared reflect broader discussions happening in the entertainment industry. It's a statement that doesn't attempt to resolve anything, but instead places the exchange within a larger context. The audience responds with a light, understanding murmur, some nodding, others simply listening. It's a moment that feels more observational than reactive. The discussion then shifts slightly toward Branagh's personal experiences. A co-host asks whether he has encountered moments during production where differing viewpoints among collaborators led to meaningful changes in a project. It's a question that brings the focus back to his direct work, rather than the broader debate. Branagh answers with a calm, reflective tone. He explains that collaboration often involves navigating different perspectives, and that those moments can strengthen a project when handled thoughtfully. He speaks about listening, about being open to reconsideration, and about the value of dialogue within a creative team. As he speaks, his tone feels slightly more relaxed than earlier, though still measured. It's clear he's comfortable discussing the process, even if the broader implications remain complex. Behar listens closely, then offers a response that builds on his point. She acknowledges that collaboration can lead to stronger outcomes, but she adds that public accountability operates differently from internal discussions. Her phrasing is less pointed than before, but the distinction she's making is clear. What happens behind the scenes isn't always visible to audiences, who only see the final result. There's a brief pause after she speaks, and the camera captures Branagh's reaction. He nods once, acknowledging the point, but there's a slight tightening around his eyes, suggesting that he's considering how to respond without reopening the earlier tension too sharply. When he does respond, his tone remains steady. He agrees that audiences engage with the final product, but he emphasizes that understanding the process can add depth to that engagement. He suggests that while not every detail is visible, the intention behind a work is still an important part of how it should be received. His delivery is calm, but there's a quiet insistence in how he frames the idea of intention. It's not a new argument, but rather a reinforcement of what he's been expressing throughout the segment. At this point, another co-host gently shifts the conversation again, asking both Branagh and Behar how they think conversations like this should continue outside of television. It's a broader, forward-looking question, one that invites reflection rather than debate. Behar answers first this time. She speaks about the importance of ongoing dialogue, especially in spaces where different perspectives can be shared openly. Her tone is thoughtful, and while she maintains her viewpoint, there's less urgency in how she expresses it. It feels more like a conclusion than a challenge. Branagh follows, echoing the importance of dialogue, but adding that listening is just as critical as speaking. He notes that conversations can only move forward when there's a willingness to understand, not just respond. His tone is even, and there's a sense of closure in how he presents his thoughts. The audience reacts with a slightly stronger round of applause than earlier moments. It's not enthusiastic in a dramatic way, but it carries a sense of appreciation for the measured tone both have maintained. As the segment nears its end, the hosts begin to transition more clearly. One of them thanks Branagh for joining the discussion, noting that it's been a thoughtful and engaging conversation. There's a brief return to a lighter tone, with a comment about his recent work, which draws a small smile from him. Behar also offers a closing remark, thanking him for being open to the discussion. Her tone is cordial, and while it doesn't signal full agreement, it reflects a level of mutual respect that has remained consistent throughout the exchange. Branagh responds with a polite acknowledgement, thanking the panel for the conversation. His expression softens slightly, and there's a sense that the more intense portion of the segment has passed. The camera briefly cuts to the audience, who respond with polite applause. Some viewers can be seen nodding, others simply watching attentively. It's not the kind of reaction that follows a dramatic moment, but rather one that reflects a thoughtful exchange. As the hosts prepare to move on, there's a final attempt to lighten the mood, a brief, casual remark from one of the co-hosts that draws a small laugh from both Branagh and Behar. It's a subtle but effective way to ease the transition, bringing the energy back to something more typical of daytime television. Even so, the conversation that just took place lingers in the atmosphere. It's clear that while the segment is wrapping up, the ideas discussed are not easily concluded. The exchange has remained respectful and grounded, but it has also highlighted a genuine difference in perspective. As Part 4 comes to a close, both Kenneth Branagh and Joy Behar have maintained their composure, navigating a complex discussion in a way that feels consistent with the tone of a show like The View. The segment is now clearly moving toward its conclusion, with the focus shifting from debate to reflection, setting up how the moment will be received both in the studio and beyond. As the segment reaches its final moments, the energy in the studio settles into something noticeably calmer than where it had been earlier. The conversation has run its course naturally, without any abrupt ending, and the transition now feels intentional, like a gradual step back from a discussion that carried more weight than expected. Kenneth Branagh sits with a relaxed posture again, his shoulders slightly eased compared to the more focused stance he held during the peak of the exchange. His expression is composed, with a polite, neutral smile returning as the hosts begin to wrap things up. Across from him, Joy Behar also appears more at ease, her tone and body language reflecting a return to the show's usual rhythm. One of the co-hosts takes the lead in closing the segment, offering a brief summary of the discussion. She highlights how the conversation touched on storytelling, audience expectations, and the balance between creative freedom and responsibility. Her tone is measured, careful not to favor one perspective over the other, instead framing the exchange as a meaningful dialogue rather than a disagreement. The audience responds with steady applause, a little more sustained than earlier transitions. It's not loud or overwhelming, but it carries a sense of appreciation for the conversation that just unfolded. Some audience members can be seen nodding, while others exchange quiet remarks with those seated beside them, suggesting that the discussion resonated on a thoughtful level. Behar offers one final comment, this time more reflective than probing. She acknowledges that these kinds of conversations don't always lead to clear answers, but they remain important. Her tone is calm, and there's a subtle shift in her delivery. Less about challenging a point, more about recognizing the value of discussing it openly. Branagh nods in agreement, offering a brief closing thought of his own. He reiterates the importance of dialogue, emphasizing that differing perspectives can coexist without needing to fully align. His voice is steady, and there's a sense of closure in how he frames his final remark. The hosts thank him once again for joining the show, and he responds with a polite expression of gratitude. The exchange, while at times tense, has remained respectful throughout, and that mutual respect is evident in these closing moments. As the camera begins to pull back slightly, the show transitions toward its next segment. There's a brief moment of lighter conversation among the hosts, something unrelated to the earlier discussion, serving as a reset for the tone of the program. The audience responds with a small laugh, and the atmosphere returns to something more typical of daytime television. But even as the show moves on, the impact of the conversation lingers. Moments like this often extend beyond the studio, and this one is no exception. Shortly after the episode airs, viewers begin reacting across social media platforms. Clips of the exchange between Branagh and Behar start circulating, with audiences sharing their interpretations of what was said. Some viewers express support for Branagh's emphasis on creative independence, appreciating his calm and measured approach. Others align more closely with Behar's perspective, agreeing with her focus on accountability and the evolving expectations placed on creators. What stands out in the online discussion is not a sense of division, but rather a continuation of the conversation that began on air. Many viewers note the respectful tone maintained by both participants, pointing out that the exchange felt grounded and authentic rather than confrontational. Media outlets and commentary programs also pick up on the moment, highlighting it as an example of how daytime talk shows can host substantive discussions without losing their sense of balance. The focus, in most cases, remains on the ideas presented rather than any perceived conflict. In the hours following the broadcast, additional context emerges as well. Short interviews and behind-the-scenes remarks from the show indicate that both Branagh and the hosts viewed the conversation as productive. There are no signs of disagreement extending beyond the segment itself, and no attempts to revisit or escalate the discussion after the fact. For regular viewers of shows like The View, the moment feels familiar in structure but notable in substance. It reflects the kind of exchange that can happen when different perspectives are given space to be expressed fully, without interruption or escalation. Back in the studio, as the episode continues, the earlier discussion is not directly referenced again. The show moves forward with its scheduled programming, maintaining its usual pacing and tone. However, for those who watched the segment unfold, the conversation remains a point of reflection. Looking at the exchange as a whole, what stands out is not any single statement, but the progression of the discussion itself. It began as a routine interview, shifted into a more focused conversation, and gradually developed into a thoughtful exploration of differing viewpoints. At no point did it lose the composure expected of daytime television, and that consistency played a key role in how it was received. Both Kenneth Branagh and Joy Behar maintained a steady presence throughout, even as the conversation moved into more complex territory. Their ability to engage without escalating allowed the discussion to remain accessible to a broad audience, while still addressing meaningful topics. As the segment fades into the broader flow of the show, it becomes clear that moments like this are part of what keeps viewers engaged, not because of conflict, but because of the opportunity to hear different perspectives presented in a measured, thoughtful way. And as viewers continue to reflect on what they saw, the conversation extends beyond the studio, becoming part of a larger dialogue that goes far beyond a single episode. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.